Captain Evelyn Carter stood rigid in the heart of the Zelver war camp, her fingers flexing at her sides as guttural laughter echoed around her. Towering reptilian warriors surrounded her, their scaled faces curled in condescending amusement. The Zelver were massive creatures, 7 feet tall at the shortest, their muscular forms reinforced by thick, armored plates running down their spines. Each movement they made exuded an air of effortless strength, and to them, she was nothing more than an amusing curiosity. A fragile human, misplaced among the galaxy's finest warriors. She is the one assigned to our unit? A deep, rumbling voice cut through the jeers. Colonel Drex, the squad leader, stepped forward. His golden eyes gleamed with skepticism, slit pupils narrowing as he surveyed her like a defective weapon. Evelyn did not move. She had expected this reaction. Humans had long been considered the weakest species in intergalactic warfare, a race of creatures too small, too slow, too fragile for true battle. Their technology was primitive in comparison to the armaments of the galaxy's dominant species. Even the diplomatic treaties humans had secured were not born of respect but of tolerance, a courtesy granted to a species seen as little more than a persistent inconvenience. "She looks breakable," another soldier sneered. His plated fingers flexed around the hilt of his combat blade. "Do you bleed as easily as your kind claims to be intelligent?" Evelyn tilted her head slightly, fixing him with a neutral stare. "Why don't you find out?" The jeering momentarily ceased, a ripple of tension passing through the gathered Zelver. A challenge. Not the cowering deference they had expected. Drex's nostrils flared slightly, an exhale of amusement, but his expression remained unreadable. "We are not here for games," he said. "We have a war to win, and I have no patience for carrying dead weight. Prove your worth, or you will be left behind." The mission briefing followed in short order, though Evelyn noticed the pointed way none of them acknowledged her presence beyond veiled insults and snide remarks. The assignment was clear. A faction of insurgents had fortified themselves in a war-ravaged city on the hostile planet of Argon 9. Their stronghold was strategically valuable, overlooking the only viable extraction route for high-ranking Allied officers. The Zelver's mission was to eliminate all enemy resistance and secure the location. Evelyn listened in silence, memorizing the layout of the terrain displayed in flickering holograms. The Zelver spoke of tactics with the blunt arrogance of a species that had never known defeat. They planned to march in as they always did, overpowering their enemy through sheer might, relying on their regenerative abilities and unbreakable armor to withstand counterattacks. It was the same reckless overconfidence that had gotten Zelver squads slaughtered in previous battles, but their pride never let them learn. When Drex assigned roles, Evelyn was dismissed with casual disregard. "You will remain in a scouting position. Observe, but do not interfere." It was an insult, plain and simple. Scouting meant being placed far from the action, relegated to an observer's role while the real warriors did the work. Evelyn bit back her irritation and nodded. She had no interest in arguing. Words would not change their minds. The journey to Argon 9 was brief, their dropship descending into the planet's desolate atmosphere with a controlled burst of propulsion. The air was thick with smoke, the ruins of the fallen city stretching across the horizon in jagged silhouettes. Fires burned in the distance, remnants of previous skirmishes casting flickering shadows against the skeletal remains of collapsed buildings. Evelyn took position atop a crumbling watchtower, the metal beams groaning beneath her as she adjusted the scope of her rifle. Below, the Zelver warriors advanced in formation, their massive frames moving with a confidence that bordered on carelessness. She exhaled slowly, scanning the ruins ahead. Something felt wrong. Then she saw it. A glint of movement in a shattered window, just beyond the Zelver's line of sight. Her finger tightened around the trigger, instinct screaming at her to act. The Zelver were walking straight into an ambush, oblivious to the enemy snipers hidden within the wreckage. Evelyn fired. The sharp crack of the gunshot echoed through the ruins, cutting through the stagnant air. A body crumpled in the distance, the insurgent sniper's weapon falling from their grasp before they could fire. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then, chaos erupted. The insurgents, realizing their cover had been compromised, opened fire. Gunfire erupted from the shadows, energy rounds slicing through the air as the Zelver scrambled for cover. Evelyn stayed locked in position, her breathing steady as she took aim again. One shot, one kill. Another sniper fell, their rifle clattering against the stone. Below, the Zelver fought back with brute force, their plasma blades igniting in arcs of burning light. They were strong, but strength alone would not have saved them from the ambush. Evelyn picked off another enemy soldier, her shots precise, methodical. By the time the last insurgent had fallen, the battlefield was littered with bodies. The Zelver emerged from cover, victorious, but not unscathed. She descended from her vantage point, her boots crunching against the rubble as she approached the squad. Blood smeared the ground, the acrid scent of burnt flesh lingering in the air. Drex turned to face her, his gaze unreadable. "Lucky shot," one of the soldiers muttered, wiping blood from a gash on his arm. Evelyn met his gaze, her expression carefully neutral. She could see it in their eyes, the subtle shift, the begrudging realization that she had saved them. But they would never admit it. Not yet. Drex studied her in silence before speaking. "You fight like a ghost. But luck can only carry you so far." She said nothing. Another soldier stepped forward, crossing his arms over his chest. "If you truly think yourself a warrior, prove it." Evelyn raised a brow. "And how exactly would you like me to do that?" A slow grin spread across his face, sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. "A test. Survive alone behind enemy lines for 24 hours. No backup, no reinforcements. If you return, perhaps we will reconsider our assumptions." A challenge. A death sentence for anyone unprepared. Evelyn glanced at the gathered soldiers, their faces filled with amusement, waiting for her to refuse. Waiting for her to show fear. She rolled her shoulders and nodded. "Fine. Let's see who laughs last." Silence settled over the squad. Then, Drex exhaled a low chuckle, his lips curling in what might have been respect or amusement. "Very well, human," he said. "Let's see if you survive the night." The Zelver warriors watched in silence as Evelyn Carter disappeared into the ruins. The jagged skyline of Argonne, 9 stretched before her, its crumbling structures bathed in the dim glow of a dying sun. Smoke curled from distant fires, carrying the acrid scent of scorched metal and death. Somewhere in the labyrinth of destruction, enemy forces patrolled the wreckage, unseen but ever-present. She had 24 hours to survive. Alone. The challenge had been issued as a joke, an impossible test meant to expose her weakness. No human could last a full day behind enemy lines, not on this planet. It was hostile in more ways than one: scarce cover, unpredictable weather, and an insurgency that thrived in the shadows. The Zelver assumed she would fail, assumed she would be hunted and disposed of before sunrise. They would return to their warship, shake their heads, and laugh at the foolishness of ever considering a human among their ranks. Evelyn intended to ensure that didn't happen. She moved quickly, slipping into the ruins without hesitation. The air was thick with dust, disturbed by her boots as she maneuvered through broken corridors and collapsed archways. The weight of her sniper rifle was a familiar comfort against her back, but she wouldn't fire unless absolutely necessary. Stealth was her greatest weapon. The moment she made her presence known, she would become prey. The city had been abandoned for years, but signs of life remained: shattered helmets, rusting weapons, footprints barely visible in the dirt. The insurgents were here, entrenched in the rubble, waiting for an opportunity to strike. She had no intention of giving them one. She climbed a dilapidated staircase, testing each step before putting her full weight down. The structure groaned but held. At the top, she pressed her back against the wall, peering through a jagged hole in the concrete. Below, the remnants of an old market stretched across the street, stalls overturned, their wares long since scavenged. At least a dozen enemy soldiers were stationed there, their weapons slung casually over their shoulders. They weren't expecting trouble. Good. She dropped to a crouch, unfastening the combat knife from her belt. A direct confrontation would be suicide. Instead, she scanned the area, noting the positioning of each soldier. Some were clustered together, speaking in hushed voices. Others stood apart, keeping watch. They weren't Zelver, not even close. Leaner, faster, but less armored. They relied on numbers, not brute strength. She could use that against them. Evelyn moved with purpose, slipping from cover to cover, her steps light against the rubble. She found her first target perched on a ledge above the others, his rifle trained lazily toward the street. He never saw her coming. She slipped behind him, one hand clamping over his mouth as her knife slid cleanly between his ribs. A shudder, a gurgled breath, then nothing. She eased his body down, wiping the blade against his tunic before retrieving his ammunition. One down. She continued her silent hunt, eliminating 2 more before the others even noticed something was wrong. A flash of movement, a body slumping to the ground, and suddenly their casual ease snapped into sharp alertness. "Something's here," one of them growled, gripping his weapon. They spread out, searching. Evelyn took advantage of their panic. She climbed higher into the ruins, positioning herself where she had a full view of the street below. The moment one of them strayed too far from cover, she fired. The shot echoed through the ruins, and another soldier dropped. Now they knew. Shouting erupted as the insurgents scrambled for cover, firing blindly into the shadows. Evelyn stayed still, heart steady, counting the seconds between their movements. She didn't need to rush. Panic made people predictable. They would flush themselves out without realizing it. Another one ran across the open street, thinking he had an opening. A single shot cut him down. The remaining soldiers hesitated. She could hear them murmuring to each other, confusion creeping into their voices. They had expected an easy patrol. Now they were being hunted. Evelyn allowed them to stew in their fear before she moved again. The moment they assumed she had fled, she struck. A thrown knife buried itself in the throat of the next soldier, his body dropping before the others could react. 2 left. They fired wildly into the ruins, their nerves shattered. She let one live a little longer, just long enough for him to believe he might survive. Then she ended it. The last one tried to run. She let him get 20 feet before her bullet caught him between the shoulders. He crumpled to the ground, lifeless. The street fell silent. She exhaled slowly, reloading her rifle with practiced ease. 11 dead, not a single alarm raised. The insurgents had no idea what had hit them. She moved swiftly, collecting weapons and supplies from the fallen. Ammunition, rations, a map, anything useful. The map was marked with enemy strongholds, notes scribbled in a language she barely recognized. It showed a larger outpost deeper in the city, a place marked with reinforced walls and heavy artillery. A command center, perhaps. If she could take it out, it would cripple their operations. She weighed her options. She could spend the next several hours avoiding patrols, playing it safe until her 24 hours were up. Or she could strike. She had their map. She had the advantage of surprise. And she was tired of being underestimated. She made her decision and moved. The Zelver were likely still watching, observing from a distance, waiting for her inevitable failure. Let them watch. Let them see what a human could do. The enemy stronghold was nestled between the ruins of what had once been a towering government building. Concrete barriers surrounded it, manned by at least 24 guards. A direct assault was impossible, but Evelyn never fought direct battles. She fought smart ones. She circled the perimeter, counting entry points, noting guard rotations. They were disciplined but complacent. No one had challenged them in a long time. Slipping into a nearby building, she found a vantage point, positioning herself for the perfect shot. The compound's power generator sat exposed in the courtyard, a fatal mistake. One bullet was all it took. The explosion ripped through the night, plunging the stronghold into darkness. The insurgents scrambled, shouting orders, confused and disoriented. Evelyn picked them off one by one, moving between positions, never staying in one spot long enough to be targeted. They had no idea where she was, no idea how many of her there were. By the time they finally regrouped, half of them were dead. The survivors abandoned the outpost, retreating into the ruins like frightened animals. Evelyn stood among the wreckage, heart pounding, adrenaline coursing through her veins. The stronghold was in flames. The enemy was in full retreat. And she was still standing. She had done what no one had expected. As the first light of dawn touched the ruined city, she made her way back toward the Zelver encampment. The challenge had been simple: survive. She had done more than that. She had hunted. Evelyn Carter moved through the ruins like a ghost, her rifle slung across her back, her senses sharp. The sun had barely crested the horizon when she reached the Zelver encampment, yet despite her silent approach, the sentries had already spotted her. Their golden eyes gleamed from the shadows, slitted pupils narrowing as they took in her return. She had been expected to fail. Instead, she was here, alive, unbroken, and walking with the quiet confidence of someone who had not just survived the night but conquered it. The gathered warriors exchanged glances, the derision in their expressions giving way to something else. Doubt. Confusion. Perhaps even the first, reluctant traces of respect. Colonel Drex stood at the center of the camp, his arms folded across his massive chest. His plated skin caught the morning light, every inch of him exuding the raw strength of a species bred for war. Yet for the first time, he regarded her without immediate dismissal. "You return," he said. Evelyn stopped a few feet from him, adjusting the strap of her rifle. "I do." One of the warriors scoffed. "Barely. She probably hid the whole time, waiting for the sun." Evelyn smirked and tossed something at his feet. A helmet, taken from one of the insurgents she had eliminated in the night. Blood still crusted its edges. A hush fell over the camp. The warrior who had spoken stared at it, his jaw tightening. Drex's gaze flickered to the helmet, then back to her. "Tell me what happened." Evelyn met his stare, unwavering. "Your intel was flawed. The insurgents were more organized than you assumed. They had a command center hidden deeper in the city, coordinating movements. If I had followed your plan, we would have walked straight into another ambush." Murmurs rippled through the camp. No one had ever spoken to a Zelver commander like that. Drex's expression remained unreadable. "And what did you do about it?" "I took it out." Silence. One of the Zelver warriors shifted, exhaling a slow breath. "Alone." Evelyn shrugged. "They never saw me coming." The weight of her words settled over them, a slow realization creeping into their features. She hadn't just survived. She had struck first, hunted the hunters, and left their enemies scrambling. Drex studied her for a long moment. Then, a slow, satisfied exhale left him. "Good." The word was simple, but in it, Evelyn heard something shift. The Zelver weren't quick to trust, nor were they generous with praise. But she had forced them to acknowledge her, not with words, but with results. Yet before she could take any satisfaction in that, something changed. A warning cry cut through the camp, followed by a deafening explosion that sent a shockwave of heat and dust through the air. Evelyn barely had time to react before the world turned to chaos. The attack came swiftly, without warning. Energy rounds lit up the ruins as enemy forces surged from the shadows, weapons blazing. The insurgents had tracked her return. They weren't just retaliating, they were hunting. The Zelver scrambled to counter the assault, but the enemy had planned this well. Their firepower was focused, precise, targeting key defensive positions before the warriors could fully mobilize. Evelyn hit the ground, rolling behind a collapsed column as a plasma blast scorched the dirt where she had stood moments before. Dust filled her lungs, her ears ringing from the impact. The Zelver might have been the strongest species in the war, but for the first time, they were not the predators. She peeked out from cover, assessing the battlefield. The insurgents had numbers on their side, moving with ruthless efficiency. They had no intention of engaging in prolonged combat. They were here to decimate and withdraw before reinforcements could arrive. Drex barked orders, rallying his warriors, but Evelyn could already see the flaws in their defense. The Zelver were powerful in open combat, but they weren't used to being hunted. They fought like they always did, charging into the fray, relying on brute force. It wouldn't be enough. Evelyn pressed herself against the ruined column, calculating. If the Zelver kept fighting like this, they would be overrun. The insurgents had planned for their tactics. But they hadn't planned for her. She reached for her rifle. Slipping through the battlefield's fringes, she moved unseen, positioning herself along the enemy's flank. Every second counted. The Zelver were holding the line, but barely. If she didn't act now, they wouldn't hold it much longer. Her scope settled on a cluster of enemy officers directing the assault from an elevated position. A single sniper shot wouldn't be enough. She needed to break their momentum. Her gaze shifted to a cache of explosives strapped to one of the insurgents' supply crates. Perfect. She exhaled slowly, steadying her aim. One shot. The bullet struck true, igniting the cache in a violent eruption of fire and shrapnel. The shock wave threw enemy soldiers off their feet, sending chaos rippling through their ranks. The insurgents faltered, their coordinated attack unraveling as panic set in. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She fired again, eliminating one of their leaders. Then another. Each shot was precise, dismantling their chain of command piece by piece. The Zelver noticed. Drex's roar cut through the battlefield as he led the charge, his warriors rallying behind him. With the insurgents in disarray, the tide shifted. The Zelver tore through their lines with renewed ferocity, striking like the apex predators they were meant to be. The enemy fell back, their numbers thinning, their confidence shattered. Evelyn kept firing, each bullet ensuring that retreat was the only option they had left. Minutes later, the battle was over. The insurgents were gone, leaving only their dead behind. Smoke curled into the sky, the scent of scorched earth mingling with a metallic tang of blood. Evelyn lowered her rifle, exhaling. It was done. She turned, only to find Drex watching her. This time, there was no skepticism in his gaze. No amusement. Just the silent acknowledgement of a warrior who had earned her place. "You hunted them," he said at last. Evelyn met his eyes. Someone had to. A slow, predatory grin spread across his face. Good. The battlefield was silent now, save for the crackle of smoldering debris and the distant wails of the dying. Evelyn Carter stood at the edge of the ruined encampment, her rifle slung across her back, her muscles aching from exhaustion. The scent of burnt metal and scorched flesh clung to the air, a bitter reminder of the chaos that had unfolded mere moments ago. The Zelver moved among the wreckage, retrieving their fallen, securing the perimeter, but none of them spoke to her. Not yet. They only watched, their golden eyes tracing her every movement as if seeing her for the first time. She could feel the weight of their scrutiny. Before, she had been nothing more than an outsider, a novelty at best, a liability at worst. Now, she had become something else. Something unexpected. A warrior. Drex stood at the heart of the encampment, surveying the aftermath. His armor was scorched, a deep gash running along his plated shoulder where an energy round had nearly ended him. But he stood tall, unwavering, his gaze shifting toward her with something resembling respect. "You changed the battle," he said at last. Evelyn wiped the sweat from her brow, meeting his stare. "I did what needed to be done." The Zelver commander tilted his head slightly. "You hunted them as they hunted us. You saw their weaknesses before they saw ours." She said nothing, letting the truth settle between them. A nearby warrior scoffed, stepping forward. He was younger than Drex but still towered over her, his ridged features twisted in disbelief. It was luck. The insurgents underestimated her. They won't make the same mistake again. Evelyn studied him, then reached into her belt pouch and pulled out a small, charred piece of metal. She tossed it at his feet. The warrior frowned, then bent to retrieve it. The moment his fingers curled around the object, his breath hitched. It was a rank insignia, torn from the chest of the insurgent commander she had killed in the sniper's nest. "Their leader never saw me coming," she said, her voice measured. "Tell me, was that luck?" The warrior's grip tightened around the insignia, but he had no retort. Drex's deep chuckle cut through the tension. "Luck does not kill an army." The murmur of the surrounding warriors shifted. Some still held onto their doubt, their distrust of a human among their ranks. But others were beginning to see the truth. Evelyn didn't wait for their approval. She turned her back to them, walking toward the outskirts of the camp. She had done what she came to do. Whether they accepted it or not didn't matter. But before she could disappear into the ruins, Drex called out, "The War Council will hear of this." She paused but didn't turn. "They will hear of the human who turned the hunt against the hunters," he continued. "And they will listen." Evelyn exhaled slowly. She had expected to fight. She had expected to survive. But she had never expected this. A legend. She stepped forward, the ruins of the battlefield fading behind her. A new war awaited, and this time, she wouldn't be fighting for recognition. She would be fighting because she was the deadliest weapon they had.